Yes, I appreciate you all joining us today. Nice to meet you, Niraj and Amanda. So I'm Zach Allison. I've started helping care with the group. Young Professionals group was started for both people earlier in their careers and also others who want to join as well. Basically, just to help people get to know each other, gain information and such. So we have two types of meetings each month. One is more focused on the informational side. That's like this one today. We'll be focusing with Amanda on the clinical trials, and the other one's going to be a bit more on the social side, so getting to know each other better, doing some fun activities like we've got planned for next month. With that, Amanda, if you want to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Amanda Hill, Director of Research and Patient Engagement at the FSHD Society. And I'm here this morning to just chat about clinical trials, maybe help share general information with folks so everyone kind of has a strong understanding of what exactly they are, what does it entail, how do I get involved if I want to, what do I expect if I do enroll in a study, what's that going to look like or feel like for me. Really whatever folks are interested in learning more about, I'd love to just generally kind of be answering questions and sharing information. And I guess I'll just introduce myself just a little bit. So my background is in biomedical research. I was working in the Down syndrome space before I moved over to the FSHD Society. I moved here about a year ago. My husband has FSHD, so I'm very excited to be working on his disease, using my professional skills to help find treatments and a cure for him. A lot of the work I do at the FSHD Society is around anything related to patients needing to be involved in research. So helping the patient population understand the research, get engaged, and then helping our pharmaceutical partners, researchers, advance their studies as well. And the FSHD Society does a lot of work in general to try to spur collaborations and really move the research world along as best as we can, help support that. So yeah, what should I can just kind of kick it off and just start talking, and maybe Zach and Lee, you guys can chime in with questions and clarifications.
Yeah, absolutely.
Try to have just a bit of a discussion this morning. Cool. So one of the first things I was thinking about is, what are clinical trials and why are they important? And, folks probably have a general understanding, but clinical trials, they are research studies, and they are performed to determine if any sort of new intervention is safe and if it actually works in people. And by intervention, that's kind of a weird word. A lot of times people think about drug development and new drugs and medicines going into clinical trials. That is absolutely correct. But we also use clinical trials to test other types of interventions. So it could be a medical device. It could also be some sort of manual therapy or other kind of practice. So there's other ways you can interfere with the course of a disease and try to change or correct that. So clinical trials really broadly covers that whole umbrella. For our purposes today, we're really going to be thinking about and talking about drugs or medicines that go into clinical trials, because that's really where things are right now in the FSHD space. Clinical trials, they are a process that is required for any sort of new drug or medicine to undergo in order to receive approval from the regulatory agencies. So those are bodies like the FDA, which if you're in the US, you've definitely heard of. That's the Federal Drug Administration. And then, there are similar bodies all across the world for all sorts of other countries, the EMA in Europe, and so on and so forth. And these are the agencies that are going to look very, very carefully at the data generated in clinical trials, excuse me, to make sure that that drug is actually doing what they say it's supposed to be doing, and that it's relatively safe, that the side effects aren't too severe, there's not any major concerns about people actually taking it. And generally, they're looking to make sure that the benefits of taking that drug, the benefits you receive from, say, slowing or stopping your disease course, really outweigh any risks that could be associated with it. And once the regulatory bodies take a look at that and give it their approval, that is the point where doctors could, in theory, start prescribing the drug. Insurance agencies will start incorporating it into their plans, their coverage plans, and start paying for it. so that patients can actually access it. So in the past, in FSHD, we have not had a ton of clinical trials. We've had a couple here and there. They've been kind of spread out, and they've all been very early, what we call early phase development. So a phase 1 or phase 2, and I can share in a few minutes what that means and what the differences are between the phases. But they're smaller trials, they're earlier on in development, and those trials in the past, they didn't progress, they didn't go further. So it's been a little bit speckled and sporadic. And in general, the biopharmaceutical companies that have been in the space, we just haven't had a lot in the past. But that has changed very recently in the last 5 years or so. We now have at least 20 different companies working on drugs for FSHD that we know of right now. And there are actually 3 clinical trials happening all at the same time right now, which is something we've never had before. And it's really exciting because and I'll say too, in addition to the 3 that we've got, we know that there are more coming very soon. So we're super stoked at this point because this means there's a lot of companies who realize there's a great opportunity to develop in the FSHD space. They're all starting to launch clinical trials. And we're calling this new era of clinical trials because, as I said, there's multiple ones running simultaneously, and we think it's going to stay this way for a while. We're kind of like push the snowball down the hill, and it's starting to pick up speed now. So we're hoping we're going to really continue down this course with a lot of really productive development of medicines for FSHD. But this does present new challenges. And one of the biggest challenges we as a community, patient community, the research community, our families and support of the FSHD patients, one of the biggest challenges we're staring at is that with lots of clinical trials comes the need for a lot, even more patients to be informed about what's happening in all those clinical trials and decide to step up and volunteer for them. And we need a lot of patients because different clinical trials have different criteria for you to be able to participate. And those are, they're chosen for, scientific standards and for data standards, and for very important reasons they are in place. But it does mean that everyone who wants to volunteer isn't necessarily going to be able to be eligible for that study, that particular study. So say 5 or 10 people might want to go into a study, but maybe only 1 or 2 of them are actually going to be eligible for that study. They might be eligible for another study down the line. But what that really means is, say a study needs 100 people enrolled, we might actually need 500 people who are interested and want to go find out more and start the process to see if they could actually get into it. So when you start compounding not 1 trial at a time, but 2 or 3 or 4 or more, you can see how those numbers really grow. And we need a lot of patients at any one point that are watching that space and they're like, oh, that trial looks cool, I want to go to that one. Let's go give it a try. So that's why we're talking about this so much. You're going to see a lot. You're going to see us at the FSHD Society harp on this a lot. Clinical trials, learn about clinical trials, come get involved, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your social media networks, any other FSHD patients you know about. Now's the time to get involved because we really want to make sure these clinical trials are successful. And that's the other point I'll make, and then I'll stop talking for a minute. But it's very important that we have the patients to fill these clinical trials because they need to be successful. If a clinical trial cannot enroll all of the patients it needs, that means it's highly likely they're not going to be able to collect the quantity of data that they need in order to then move on to the next step, in order to then submit to the regulatory bodies. And if they don't have that data, then the drug will never get approved and it will never get to patients. And when that happens, when a clinical trial fails, our concern is that other drug companies will look at that and be like, oh gosh, that company couldn't fill their clinical trial with enough patients. Are we going to have enough patients in our trial? Yeah. And that it could slow down the development and it could even scare away investment in the field. So it's, again, to keep that snowball rolling, we really want and need the patient community to be stepped up and involved in these studies.
I think the thing about that also sort of worries me a little is not only would that could a trial potentially fail, not just because of a lack of enrollment, then that could be a life-altering disease course slowing compound that sits on a shelf that someone else may not pick up. And so we could lose that opportunity for something that really works to find its way to patients, and it could just, die on the shelf somewhere. So that need for massive amounts of patient engagement and involvement in the clinical trial process is something we're really keenly focused on. Can you talk a little bit, Amanda, about, we're really needing to get some younger folks who are engaged in the research versus sort of maybe our core of our constituents now, the folks that are really engaged with us tend to skew a little older right now. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important?
Yeah. So for clinical trials, the population of people that enroll in it, it really needs to reflect the population of people that will actually be taking the drug, because they want to make sure that all the folks that are eventually going to be taking that drug are represented in that trial. So if there is some sort of a interaction or problem that arises, we know about it and we can address it. So if, say, we fill our clinical trials with a whole bunch of folks aged 50 to 65, because, and it makes sense. I think a lot of those folks have seen more progression as they've gotten older. So they're even more urgently seeking that medicine, maybe than someone who's younger, who is so far may or may not be quite as affected. I'm obviously just speaking very general terms here. But if those clinical trials get filled up 80% of, an older generation, only 20% of that younger generation, then we don't really have a good picture and a good representation of that younger group moving forward to know what could be different in someone younger who maybe certain hormones are a little bit different in the younger person, and we haven't seen, maybe there's a different interaction or the drug works a little differently in that group. So that's really important, that we need to fill the trials with a diverse group of people that represent the actual patient population. And we need the younger folks engaged in that process. And some of the studies, I think the designs of the studies, in that what criteria they're looking for the patient profile to fit, it lends itself well to that younger group as well. So I think there's a really ripe opportunity for the younger folks to get plugged into those.
You want to tell a little? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Zach. You had a question.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I saw a number, like an estimate, saying that we would need about 8,000 people to join the trials over the next, maybe 5 to 10 years. Can you walk through a bit on how you see us getting there, given we've got a smaller population size for this disease?
That's a really great question.
Good question.
So
we actually think it's 8 to 10,000. Yeah. So we think that 8 might even be a little bit of an under.
Yeah. And that is projected from, general observations and projections, I suppose, in the field broadly, that in general, you need about at least 1% of your whole patient population to be in clinical trials to fill that need. That's just kind of a general number, I suppose. And when you think, as I was talking about earlier, when you think about kind of that ring multiplies for, each 100 patients that you need enrolled, you need 500 to maybe 1,000 to find those 100 patients. You can see how that will multiply very quickly. And yes, so how we want to look to fill that. So our role at the FSHD Society is to help all of our patient community really live their best life with FSHD. We want you to be plugged into community. We want you to have all the information you could possibly need about living with this disease, and to know all of the avenues with which you can live the best life possible with FSHD. So a really important part of what we see our role over the coming years is making sure that every patient understands what clinical trials are. They know what they could do for them. They know what their opportunities are. They know exactly how to get plugged in. They know where their nearest clinical trial sites are. They fully understand this process, and they have all the information they need to make decisions about whether or not it's the right step for them. We don't want anyone to not go to clinical trials simply because they didn't realize that this was an option, a viable option for them. So we are going to be doing everything we can to reach all the patients that we know of. We are going to be partnering with other patient advocacy organizations in other parts of the world where clinical trials are happening to do the same thing all over the world. Because that's not just here in the US where we tend to, a lot of us are located at the society, but it's all over the world that this is going to be happening. We also know that we need to find new patients that maybe haven't engaged with the patient advocacy organizations. So those patients might be diagnosed and they've just never engaged. They also maybe don't have a diagnosis. There could be a lot of FSHD patients out there that don't know they have FSHD. So that's where things like educating clinicians is really important. We need to make sure that clinicians across specialties, not even just in the neuromuscular space or the neurology space, but other any sort of clinician that sees people should be able to see some of the signs that could be FSHD or other issues. Obviously, there's this opens up a whole nother can of worms, but the theory is that we want to make it more recognizable. The disease needs to be more recognizable to folks so that when someone has it and they're showing symptoms, people recognize it and they're like, I think I know what that might be. You should go get this checked out. So there needs to be education into other types of clinicians and other healthcare professionals. And then we also are working on investing in the space in genetic testing and getting more patients diagnosed properly. To go into a clinical trial, you do need a real diagnosis of FSHD. It can't just be that it's in your family and that's what you have. You need to be clinically and actually genetically diagnosed. So in most cases, the studies will do that for you. They'll provide a genetic test if you don't have it yet. If you don't have a clinical diagnosis, though, they may or may not talk to you. You might need to go get at least that clinical diagnosis first. So, for where there's families that they know they have this, but maybe it's not in their medical record. They haven't formally gotten that diagnosis. They're not showing up in, when we do, there are ways we can look at, say, medical records data across, a whole country and pull out and be like, here's all the FSHD patients. There are 12,000 patients with FSHD in this database. But if someone doesn't have that diagnosis, they're not in there, so they're not represented. So we need to be getting people diagnosed clinically, genetically. We want them to be getting plugged in and engaged with their patient advocacy organizations so they get the information about the clinical trials and don't get missed.
Can I clarify one thing on that? Just to be, we don't see your medical records, so we don't know that John has FSHD. But we don't relate it to a person. It's de-identified. We can work with a partner to see how many people have the diagnostic code on their record. And then, so just point of clarity, I don't want anyone thinking that Big Brother is watching and now we know exactly who you are and where you live. That's not what it is. There is a few years ago, I believe it was 2018, there was a designated diagnostic medical code specific for FSHD. We have that information on our site. And we recently found that, what did June say? It was like only less than 600 people have that code on their record. We don't know who those
in the database that we were using.
In the database that we had access to. We just know the number of people that are accessing that code. And so that makes it hard if you have a general diagnosis of just muscular dystrophy, and the drug specifically targets FSHD. There's all sorts of challenges of, the doctors knowing to prescribe a particular therapy to you once it is approved specifically for FSHD, all the folks that look at prevalence factors and all of that. So there's the medical education with the doctor. So we have a continuing medical education credit course that we put out that we routinely promote to clinicians. There's the diagnostic code that we're encouraging individuals to ask their doctors to receive, as well as patients can go in and ask their doctor to say, I want to make sure I have this diagnostic code on my record. And there's a whole lot of just marketing, communications, community and network building, which is why groups like this are so important. So all of our gathering place groups meet a need, meets people where they are, and helps them connect with folks that are in a similar space in their journey with FSHD, and that kind of community connection through our support gathering place groups, through the chapters, through events like the walk and roll. Those are all ways that help the patients find the community, find us, and find the help they need. And so, and right now, the FSHD Society is one of the only organizations that is sort of the full package, right? So we not only do the research, but we do all of the education and patient support. And there's just not a lot of that out there being done by many other groups. And so that's why groups like this are really important too. That's a piece of it. I didn't mean to cut you off, Amanda. I just wanted to.
No, please. Those were great points.
Yeah.
Julie.
Yeah.
And then I know a lot of the specific trials eligibility criteria is on the clinicaltrials.gov website. Can you walk through there generally, just what types of criteria do the
Yeah,
researchers
absolutely.
look for?
Actually, I think if it's all right, I might share my screen because I want to show, we are working on some updated material on our own website. So our website also has has the same information that's on clinicaltrials.gov, but we're trying to put it in a little bit more of an understandable manner, friendly to read manner. Clinicaltrials.gov can be confusing to navigate. That being said, it's still a bit of a necessary evil. We still need to go there to get some of the information. But what we have done on our website is started to work to help make that process a little easier. And so I did want to share, I'm going to just, where's my, get you over here. So
We're seeing it looks good.
great. Thank you, Lee. So this is our clinical trials landing page. You can get here by clicking, oh, what's happening? By clicking get involved. Whoa. And then under the advanced research tab, you can click clinical trials. You can also get here through research for patients and families, clinical trials.
And also the direct URL of just fshdsociety.org/clinical trials.
That is
If
correct.
you forget the navigation, we've set up a direct URL to it too.
So we have some just overview information here about what clinical trials are. We're going to be adding a lot of material to this page in the coming weeks and months. So guys can keep checking back for more updates and information. There are some links here so you can learn more about a clinical trial. We have a practical guide to participating. But what I did want to show here was we're always going to have up here the studies that are currently enrolling. And let's open up, this is the Fulcrum Reach clinical trial. This is a phase 3 clinical trial of a drug called losmapimod. This is kind of the big one that's happening right now that most people are talking about. This is actually our first phase 3 clinical trial that we've ever had in the FSHD space. So super, super exciting. That phase 3 study is generally the final step before the FDA or the EMA will look at all of the data for a drug and make a decision about whether or not they're going to approve it. So this is a very pivotal clinical trial that's happening right now. So we have here just a little info overview of what it is. This phase 3, the purpose of the study, it's obviously to test whether losmapimod can slow or even stop the progression of FSHD, look at how safe it is, and then look at what the side effects of taking it might be. So if we hit learn more here, and this is going to be done for all of the studies as they're going on, and this will give you, this page will give you a nice overview of what is this study, what's the medicine, what do I need to know about it, and then we have a section here for eligibility, which you asked about, Zach. So this is not every single detail of eligibility, but this is kind of the big nuts and bolts that as a patient who's looking at whether this study might be right for you, can evaluate yourself against here. So, and this is divided up into 2 sections. So first of all, you need to have these things, but then also the study team has to look at certain things and only they can do that. So you by yourself can never fully tell if you're eligible for a clinical trial or not. So it's always good. You always are going to need to contact the study team, but you can self-evaluate a little bit here. You must have FSHD 1 or 2. You must be between 18 and 65, and you need to be able to undergo an MRI. So if you've got a piece of metal somewhere in your body and you can't have an MRI, you actually won't be able to participate in this study. And then the study team will look at you and they'll assess the severity of your FSHD using a tool that they use clinically called the Ricci Clinical Severity Scale. That's something that a doctor or a PT has to do the assessment, has to assess you for. And then they're also going to look at the degree of kind of your shoulder and arm involvement using another clinical assessment called the Reachable Workspace. And then we have here criteria that might exclude you from the clinical trial. You would not be able to take part if you are completely dependent on a walker or wheelchair for activities. So you need to be able to be mobile and moving on your own. This is a little bit of a gray line. So again, if you're not sure where you fall on this, you will need to talk to the study team. So you'll have to get in touch with that group. Certain medical conditions will exclude you. Again, you're going to want to talk to the study team about this, though, to get very specific. And then certain medications will exclude you as well. And once again, you're going to have to talk to the study team. They will go over all of those details with you. And we do have a link here. You can view a bit more detail of the exclusion criteria on clinicaltrials.gov. This just clicked me directly into the fulcrum losmapimod clinicaltrials.gov page, and you can see it actually went directly to the eligibility criteria section. So this is a bit more detail. There's a lot of stuff here that may or may not make a lot of sense to you. For example, this exclusion criteria: orally administered CYP3A4 substrates and MATE and OATE substrates. Like, you may, if you're on some drug that has one of those things, you probably don't know what that means. So again, you're going to have to talk to the study team about these details. Now, how you would do that is actually would be here on clinicaltrials.gov. I'm going to go back. I think that this opened. Yep, this opened a new page for me. I'm going to go back to our web page. How to sign up. Here's what I'm looking for. So we're detailing here a bit of info about how many volunteers are needed. This particular study needs 230 people to enroll. Where are the study sites located? So there are actually 36 locations for this study. They're in the US, Canada, the United Kingdom, Spain, France, Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Italy. To find specific sites, you do have to go to clinicaltrials.gov. And on clinicaltrials.gov, they have contact information for your study site. Excuse me, I'm like still clearing my throat a lot this morning. If the site is actually recruiting, my cursor, if you can see it, is what I'm talking through this information here. If the site is marked as recruiting, there's usually a way to contact them there. And some sites might be not yet recruiting, but they'll still have the contact information listed. That means they're getting ready. You could still reach out to them. You might not hear from them for a while because they're still getting things ready. But if the contact info is there, you can go ahead and reach out. And once you do reach out, I think it's important to know it can take several weeks or even months to hear back. So you do need to be patient. As I mentioned, sometimes sites are still in the process of getting ready to start enrolling patients. It's very involved. These studies are very, very complex, involved. They're difficult to launch. They're difficult to coordinate all the logistics for. It can take some time to get that all up and running. And sometimes sites have a lot more patients than they actually can enroll. And so it's a process of working through a list and prioritizing who they bring in, like who do we think is going to most likely be able to qualify? That's the next person I'm going to bring in. So you don't know where you are on that list, but so it could take a little while to hear back, but you should keep checking back in once you reach out to your study site, maybe every month, every other month, just to let them know, hey, I'm still here, I'm still interested. Are there any updates? Just a short, sweet check-in never hurts. So I'm going to go back to where are the study sites? So you mentioned that. Again, we've got a link directly to the page on clinicaltrials.gov. It opens up contacts and locations. And what you can see here, that Fulcrum does have a call center set up centrally through Fulcrum, so you can do that. I would probably recommend that you do is you go directly to your study site if possible. So I just opened up this carrot for the 36 study locations, and they're all listed here by country, by state. And you can see, I mentioned, are they enrolling or recruiting or not? Excuse me. These sites that are listed enrolling by invitation, This usually means they're not taking new patients outside of their site. So they are actively enrolling participants in the study, but they're enrolling from the patients that they already have established at their clinic, and they don't have room to take in any new patients at this particular time. But someone who is marked recruiting, they're open. So you can go ahead and reach out to this site. If you're in the Los Angeles area or you're able to travel to Los Angeles, you can go ahead and contact Jennifer. Here's her phone number, here's her email, let her know you're interested in the REACH study. And again, so this long list here of all of these sites, this is where you find this information. Notably, all of our non-US sites, look at this list of all of these recruiting sites. So those of you who are in Canada, who are anywhere in Europe and can get yourselves to Denmark, France, Germany, all of these places, these sites are either recruiting now or they're coming up very soon. Italy's not quite open yet, but they're working on it here. So all of these spaces in Europe are open and recruiting. So please find your closest site and go ahead and reach out to them. This is kind of the process that you would go through for all of the sites, right? So, or sorry, all the sites. You would go through this for each of the studies. You have to look at each study individually, look at that criteria, look at the locations and see, you know, does this maybe fit me? Do I maybe fit this criteria? Am I willing and able to travel to one of these study sites? And if so, you can go ahead and reach out and start the conversation. So this, once you reach out, the study coordinator will, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you guys again. But once you reach out, that's basically going to start a conversation with a study coordinator on that team, where they'll share some more information about the study with you, maybe schedule a phone call or a Zoom chat to give you some more information, ask some basic questions to find out, do I think you would be eligible? They might ask some more specifics about your health history or what medications you're on. They might ask for you to send them your genetic testing because they want to confirm that you've been genetically tested. So there'll probably be some back and forth that you would need to go through with those coordinators. If they continue to think that you're a good fit, that you would likely qualify for the study, then once the scheduling allows, again, I'll emphasize that these visits are very complicated to schedule, and you'll see why once you get into one. But they'll get you scheduled for what's called a screening visit. And that's when you would come into the actual clinic. Usually a really long day. There's a lot of activities that need to get completed in that screening process. But that's going to be where they ultimately figure out if you are eligible to fully enroll and participate in the study. So there would be, you would go through an informed consent process where you'll learn all the details about the study, all of the risks, the benefits, how everything's going to work. And you would decide there, you know, do I want to proceed with this or not? Or do I need some time to think about it? And you'll go through that process with them. And if you decide to move forward, you know, you'll probably fill out a lot of questionnaires about your health history and how your FSHD has impacted your life. You'll do blood work. You'll do a whole bunch of assessments. You might get an MRI or you might do a biopsy. It's just going to depend on the study. But all of these things will happen at the screening visit. It can take several hours. It can be a really long day. And only after the results of all of that comes back in will the study team come back and say to you, all right, you can enroll, you're eligible, or actually you're not going to be eligible because of this blood abnormality or something, you know, whatever comes back there. So that's kind of an overview of the getting involved process. That's what it will look like.
That's helpful. And then one question I had is, as you mentioned, sometimes you connect to a site and it takes a little while to find out whether or not you'll actually get to go to the on-site screening. Would you then suggest that people that are interested in joining a trial connect to a couple of sites and increase their chances that way?
Yep, you picked up on a great point. If you're able to travel and you're willing to do that, do reach out to several sites that are in your region, because one site might fill up faster than the other, and you might actually be able to get into a different site if you can do that traveling. But that is an important thing to consider because it kind of depends. It will depend on each study how many times you actually have to be there in person and how many times you would need to travel. So you'll have to think about, can I take time off work, to travel 4 or 6 times over the next 4 or 6 months? I don't know what that's going to look like. You will have to talk to the study coordinators, but those are things that you need to think about. However, I will point out that most studies reimburse for travel expenses. So the direct costs of airfare, renting a car, buying meals while I'm out traveling, a hotel, all of those things are usually covered by the study so that you're not incurring those costs. And that being said, there are other things like we just said, you need to consider time away from work, maybe it impacts your childcare, whatever that is at home. Those sorts of things you'll have to navigate and will be responsible for. But those direct travel costs are usually covered by the study, which is nice.
Okay. And then, as you mentioned, people, especially ones that are younger, they tend to think they can do this later because they may not be as progressed at that point. From my perspective, like wherever I'm at now, I don't know how it's going to progress, so it makes sense to get involved early, especially given that it might take like 4 to 6 years for something to get to market if it's successful. Can you kind of walk through how you would advise people through that consideration?
Yeah, I think you really nailed everything on the head with what you just said, Zach. That the drugs that are being developed are, well, 2 things. So some of the drugs that are being developed are meant to block DUX4, which is the gene that gets abnormally expressed in FSHD and is what causes that muscle weakness and the disease progression. So the earlier you can stop that, the earlier you can start blocking DUX4, the better off, in theory, hopefully, you're going to be over the course of your lifetime. I don't know for sure, but that is the thinking. That's why we're all doing these clinical trials. That's where all the research is going, right? So even if you feel like I'm not super highly impacted yet, if you do fit into those criteria, it could be greatly to your benefit because you could be making, and you'll never know for sure, obviously, but the hope is that you would be improving your longer term outcomes as well. There was another aspect that you mentioned.
I was going to ask about if you've been on, can you explain what happens if you've been in a trial and you're on the drug and the trial ends? Does a patient still have access to the drug?
That's what I was thinking. That was the other thing I was thinking about. Thank you. Read my mind. So another reason to seriously consider getting involved earlier rather than later is that oftentimes clinical trials will have a way for you to continue to access the drug for some period of time, even after the clinical trial ends. Not all the time, so it's not a guarantee, but a lot of times they'll do something called an open label extension. So, and this, if they have that planned, it's oftentimes on clinicaltrials.gov. Sometimes they'll add it partway through the study. But this is a really common thing to do, especially when there's not a lot of other good options for patients at the time. And this is a planned period where everyone who was enrolled in the study, even if they were on the placebo, which is something we haven't talked about yet, but usually a group of patients are not receiving the real drug, they're receiving a placebo. So that there's a control group to be compared to. That in the open label extension, if you opt into it, regardless of whether you were receiving the drug or the placebo in the main trial, you can opt into this open label extension and receive the drug for maybe a year or maybe 2 years, maybe indefinitely. It all depends on the company and the study. But a lot of times there is a way for you to continue to access that drug for some time, even after the clinical trial. And that helps bridge the gap between when you're on that study to when the drug hopefully might actually receive approval and you could get it through your doctor. The other way that companies will do this, very similar, but it's called something different, is through expanded access programs. And that is, again, designed to help patients access those treatments even before they get approved, if they're looking safe and there's not other good options available. And it's also a way for the drug companies to continue to collect more data about the safety and efficacy, even outside the clinical trial. So both of those things are ways, again, the company gets more data to understand their drug. And the patients have more ways to access those therapies even after the clinical trial has ended. Or in the case of an expanded access program, they might be able to get into that program even if they couldn't get into the clinical trial. So those are, I would say, added incentives for getting involved sooner than later.
One additional point related to the open label extension. I was looking at one trial and wasn't sure whether I wanted to join because there's stage 1, stage 2, and they were testing on the dosage. So I didn't want to be on like a low dose that may not be effective and then just be stuck on that for a couple of years. One of the doctors I've spoken to that is an expert in this, he said that typically they're expecting to up the dosage just to address that concern for the patients. Can you touch on that a little bit as well?
Yeah, I think that's accurate as well. So let me just back up because we're talking about different phases. Let me just give a quick overview of what the different phases of clinical trials are, and then I'll hop back to this phase 1 question and the drug dosing. So clinical trials are typically done in 3 phases, 1, 2, 3, pretty straightforward. In phase 1, that's typically the first time a drug has ever been in people. So there's a lot of unknowns at that point. So the companies they're trying to figure out what the best dose is that doesn't have a lot of side effects, but is still maybe having some effect. And they're just trying to understand like what happens when we put this drug into people. What might the side effects be? Is it safe? They're just it's very conservative kind of first step. So there's usually a low number of patients involved, and it's focused on finding dosing. And then they do studies kind of on the blood to like see how is the drug interacting biologically? Is it doing the things we think it's doing? So that's a phase 1. Phase 2 is kind of the next step from there. Now that you've got a dose established that you know you want to move forward with, they're going to start to expand the patient population a bit. It'll be a little bigger, and they're going to continue understanding the safety of that drug, but they're going to start to look more specifically at, is it actually interfering with the disease progression? Is it being effective at stopping disease? And then if yes, again, they'll move into phase 3. This is even bigger population, even wider swath of patients. And that's where they're really getting kind of the bigger numbers, really solidifying that safety and the efficacy data so that they can submit that data to the FDA, to the EMA, whatever their regulatory body is. So that's kind of the different purposes of the trials, of the phases of the studies. In phase 1, as you mentioned, a lot of times they're just looking at dosing. And a lot of times I think the study design will be a little bit flexible in that if one dose is, maybe there's too high of a side effect for certain doses, they'll stop that. If one dose is not having any effect, but they're seeing a good effect in the slightly higher dose, they might move people over into that higher dose. So there's sometimes some of this flexibility built in where the investigators for the trials can move patients around and make sure that you're on, once they have the information, they can make sure you're on that more correct dose, if you would.
That's helpful. And then, as you mentioned earlier, there's about 20 companies doing research right now, which one that's encouraging because more companies testing products, the more likely it is one will be successful. But the other, from what I've seen, there's also different types of products, so different avenues in case one avenue just doesn't work. Can you kind of at a high level explain what the different avenues or approaches are, types of drugs?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So let's see. I think one way to think about this is different types of drugs, and I don't want to get too technical or too outside of kind of anyone's spheres, but there are different ways that you can target the disease. So let's see. I don't want to approach this. So FSHD is caused, there's a genetic cause for FSHD. And so one way that folks can develop drugs is by correcting the DNA changes that happen. Another way that you can develop drugs is you leave the DNA alone, but there's another molecule in the biological process called RNA, and RNA is essentially a copy of the DNA, and then it goes and gets the RNA gets made into a protein. The protein is what actually is functioning in your body and having effects. So there's kind of these 3 levels. There's the DNA, there's the RNA, and then there's the protein. So you can target drug development at any of those 3 steps in that biological process. So right now, there are companies working on DNA therapies that would alter at the DNA level. None of those are in clinical trials yet. There are companies that are working on drugs that target the RNA. So the DUX4 RNA, and that is Avidity's drug is actually a drug that targets at the RNA level. So it finds the DUX4 RNA and essentially captures it and degrades it. And then there are companies that work at the protein level that they're targeting the DUX4 protein. So fulcrum's lismapimod is that. So they have a molecule that finds the DUX4 protein, or I'm sorry, that is actually inaccurate. The fulcrum drug actually works on a different protein, but then that protein has an impact on the DUX4 protein. So I hope I'm not being too confusing, but there's a lot of different ways that you can target this pathway that DUX4 works in. And there are a lot of different types of drugs that you can develop to do each of those things. And then another way that you can develop drugs for FSHD is not necessarily the DUX4 pathway specifically, but just more broadly, muscle development and muscle regulation. So that's those are actually the clinical trials that we've had in the past have all been targeting muscle growth. So it's a completely different biological pathway, but obviously it's important in FSHD. And so the Roche trial that's coming up now is actually a drug that they think will help improve muscle growth. So they're not stopping DUX4, but they are helping hopefully your muscles grow and strengthen a bit more. There's a lot of different approaches. There's also being developed stem cell therapy type approaches. There's really a wide swath of things happening.
Thanks. And then you touched on a few of the key considerations people may have in not wanting to get connected to trial. One was financial, which you kind of said a lot of the times the trial company is going to reimburse the costs, and others time which they would have to take some time off from work or other obligations. I think the main one that we haven't really touched on is potential risk to the trial. I know that's definitely trial specific, but to whatever extent it makes sense to touch on that one, just to kind of help people think that one through.
Yep, there are always risks. So as I mentioned, especially in the earlier phases, these drugs have been in less people or haven't been in any people for the case of a phase 1. So there are risks of side effects or kind of unintended consequences of those drugs. So you do need to be willing to, you have to go in knowing that you could have some sort of a negative impact. More often than not, it's minor, like maybe you have some nausea or headache or you're feeling tired. Or say, for example, maybe the drug is meant to be an infusion. So you have to do, you have a vein, a needle in your vein. You might have some pain or some bruising around that. Like those are all considered side effects and risks for being in a clinical trial, and they're going to be different for everyone. As clinical trials progress through the phases, we generally have a better idea of what to expect. So when you go into a phase 3, the study team will probably outline for you, this is what we expect to see. Some patients, and the likelihood of each one. So you'll have a better idea going into that phase 3 of what the side effects and some of those health risks might be, more so than in the phase 1. It's a little bit more unknown at that point. So that could weigh out for you. If you want to really know what you're getting yourself into, then you probably want to look for a phase 3. If you're okay with a little more risk, but could be maybe higher reward, like you said, maybe you get on a really great drug early in its development, earlier on for you in that phase 1, maybe you're okay with the slightly higher risk in that scenario. So that's something each person will have to weigh. Another kind of, I maybe you could consider this a risk, and I mentioned this earlier, was you could be taking a placebo. So especially in the phase 2 and phase 3, there's usually a placebo group in the study design. And that is a group of patients that are receiving something that looks just like the drug, but is not actually contain the active ingredients. So it's not actually the drug. And this is done for good reason. They need to make sure that the drug is having the effect they think it's having, and they need to have that group to compare back to. But you will not know you don't get a say into whether or not you receive placebo. You don't even know whether or not you're on the placebo. The study team usually doesn't even know whether or not you're on placebo. So that is another risk going in for you personally. It's like, am I okay with potentially taking a placebo and not having the real drug? That's something else to consider in that process. What else? Let's see. I think those are the main things. And, you know, a lot of times as part of the study design, they'll do different assessments or they do blood work. And I mentioned like maybe there's an MRI, maybe there's a muscle biopsy. There are risks associated with any of those sorts of procedures. But it's just the same as if you had gone into your doctor and had to have that done clinically. So that's usually about kind of the same level of risk associated with those things as well.
That makes sense. And then one thing that was stressed to me is until I can hopefully get connected to trial, it makes sense to join MOVE so they can do more of the natural history study. Can you touch a bit more on how that research can contribute to the clinical side?
Yeah, so the natural history studies, the MOVE study, those are designed to just really have a much deeper understanding of the disease progression and to help design better endpoints and outcomes for clinical trials. So a big part of what they're doing in MOVE is trying to understand how do we measure FSHD best and what are the most effective types of measurements and what is most meaningful for patients. You know, we could measure XYZ, we could measure hand strength, arm strength, leg strength, but what is actually the most impactful for a patient's life? And so all of those things are being looked at in the MOVE study, and we use that data to then design clinical trials that are going to be most impactful. They're going to collect the best quality of data, going to be able to show the most meaningful change in the patient population. And that has to be done through the MOVE study. So the MOVE study is called an observational study. There's no intervention, there's no drug. They're just watching and observing you and doing those assessments many times over the years. If you decide clinical trials aren't right for me, I don't want that risk. Maybe you aren't actually eligible for clinical trials in general because of the way their criteria are currently set. Do the MOVE study, because a big part of the MOVE study is actually going to help improve future clinical trial design and make it more feasible to maybe broaden those eligibility criteria and to do clinical trials that are maybe less burdensome on the patients, so on and so forth. So the MOVE study still accelerates clinical trials greatly, and it's going to help improve them for the future. So if you're not doing clinical trials now, you should be in the MOVE study, absolutely.
And then one question I forgot to ask, you mentioned that the main benefit to join at like a phase 1 is to get access to the treatment earlier relative to waiting for maybe a safer stage 2 or 3. Typically the timeline there between the two would be what, like typically 2 or 3 years?
Probably, yeah. Yeah, a couple years. It can take some time, especially the way the studies in FSHD are designed right now. It does take about a year to measure progression because the disease is generally slower progressing. It does seem all of the studies that are happening right now, they are about a year long. So that's the timeline that they need to see if there is any meaningful change happening. So yeah, if you think about phase 1 taking a year, they'll have to collect the data, get ready for phase 2. That's going to take at least a year. Collect the data, get ready for phase 3. Like those are multi-year processes. So yep, it will be a longer timeline.
And then I think Avidity had a phase 1-2 and maybe 1-2B, something like that. Can you kind of explain how they combine it like that?
Yeah, so seeing a phase 1-2 is pretty common. That's where they'll do kind of the initial dosing studies, that initial first look on the few patients, make sure it's safe, start to look at dosing. And then they'll just kind of roll that into or along at the same time, they'll also start looking at the phase 2 stuff where they'll maybe pick a dose and carry that through, look at a longer time point, start looking at marker like assessments and markers to look at disease progression and not just the safety of the drug and that dosing. So they'll kind of merge the two objectives and just do one one slightly bigger study and accomplish all of those things at once. It's not uncommon trial design.
Cool. Well, that was all I had for questions, and Niraj said he was good as well. Do you have anything else that would make sense to touch upon? Or
What was that? Sorry.
do you have anything else that would make sense to touch
Yeah,
on
let
before
me see. I had written some notes. I think we've covered everything I was thinking about. Yeah, I think we got a lot of ground covered. This has been really great. We are going to be having, as I mentioned, more and more resources on that clinical trials landing page. So be checking back there over the coming weeks. The other thing we're working on right now is we are going to be putting out a survey soon. We want to know and hear from the patients and families who are thinking about clinical trials. Like, what are your questions? What are your concerns? What do you need to feel that you're prepared for that process? We're going to be putting out a survey to ask you, please tell us those things so we can make sure we're addressing all of those questions. And then for the patients who maybe have already participated in a clinical study, maybe they did one of the clinical trials in the past, maybe they're doing one of the current ones right now. We want to hear, what was your experience like? Do you have advice for others? What do you want to share about your experience? So we're kind of doing this clinical trial survey for the community. We really want to make sure that we can voice your stories here, give light, shed light, and share your experiences, and then address any questions, concerns you have moving forward. So that survey will be going up on our website. I actually don't have an exact date, I apologize, but within the next week or two at the most. It will be on that clinical trials page. You'll go there, you'll see a banner on top. It'll be really obvious. So be looking for that. We'll make sure we ping everyone and share it. But please do respond to that survey, because that'll help us make sure we're meeting you all where you are.
Yeah, I'll be sure to look out for that. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Zach. It was good to meet you.
You as well. Thanks, Niraj.
All right. Bye, everyone.